15 countries have signed the world's largest free trade agreement. China is in, but the United States is out. So why is the Asia-Pacific Partnership so important, and how will it help the region's economy? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Bernard Smith. A third of the global economy comes under the new Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. China, 10 Southeast Asian nations, along with South Korea, Japan, Australia and New Zealand, have signed up. The US is excluded, leaving China as the dominant economy in the bloc. We'll bring in our guests in a moment. First, this report from Florence Louis in Kuala Lumpur.
After 8 years of talks, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, is finally signed. Meeting virtually because of the pandemic, leaders from 15 countries, including China, Japan, and 10 members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, inked the agreement in their respective countries.
The conclusion of RCEP negotiation, the largest free trade agreement in the world, will send a strong message that affirms ASEAN's leading role in supporting the multilateral trading system, creating a new trading structure in the region.
It's an ambitious deal, covering nearly 30% of global economic output and a third of the world's population. The agreement aims to lower tariffs and open up trade and investment in stages. It will provide a simpler trading framework, meaning businesses won't have to navigate separate requirements to export to different countries. China is the biggest member in the trading bloc. Its importance in the region grew even more after the US, led by President Donald Trump, pulled out of a trade pact in 2017. That deal, then known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, would have been the biggest trade deal in the world. Analysts say China is now poised to extend its influence even further.
That does not mean that things are going to change overnight dramatically, but as things unfold over the future and new issues come up that need to be handled, RCEP is going to be one of those platforms that determines it. And simply because of who's the member, and of course China is the largest member, that does, I think, put China in a very influential position over the future development of trade in the region.
This is also the first free trade deal between rival East Asian countries, China, Japan and South Korea. The deal falls short in some areas. Member states weren't able to agree on some of the provisions on e-commerce. The agreement also does not include environmental protections or set labour standards. The pact will come into force once enough member states ratify the agreement domestically, a process that could take up to 2 years. Florence Louis, Al Jazeera, Kuala Lumpur.
Let's bring in our guests. In Kuala Lumpur, we have Kim Beng, the founder of the Strategic Pan-Indo-Pacific Arena think tank, and he's also the former Director of Political and Security Community in the ASEAN Secretariat. In London, there's Gareth Leather, a senior economist at Capital Economics, where he specialises in emerging markets and Asian economies. And joining us from Washington, D.C. is Stan Voiger, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Welcome to you all. I'll start with you, Kim Beng. China is clearly the biggest economy in this grouping. What are its priorities now that this deal is signed? Why is China so in favour of it?
Well, the headlines all over the world seems to be echoing the belief that China will be gaining from this agreement because it's the largest agreement, free trade agreement ever. It comprises 30% of all the GDP in the world. But having said so, China is an economy that is also trying to carefully navigate its way into the future in light of the pandemic that it just came out from, and also the pandemic which might become endemic throughout the world in spite of what we have seen in Pfizer, BioNTech, or even Moderna, where the vaccine has an efficiency rate of more than 92 to 94%. So China is actually very secure and very safe in its own cocoon. However, China is a country that relies immensely on globalization to benefit from the from all the benefits of free trade, if I may put it that way.
Okay.
So China can gain from it. However, if we look at what the Chinese leadership had agreed on the 5th plenum on October 29, just a month ago, they have basically come out with a plan, a 5-year plan, to try to steer China into an economy that can provide high quality growth. And it's not stated in the communique of the 5th plenum, but at the back of the mind of all the decision makers and the economic planners in China, they have 100 smart city plans already in the works.
Okay.
Now, if we look at that in the context of what we have achieved today across the region, which is RCEP, we could conclude that we are either few steps behind China, because China has already come up with plans to steer its economy forward, and it has also gone beyond deregulation. But RCEP is something that focuses more on the old economy, where even the electronic commerce was not given significant emphasis except the reduction of tariff.
Okay,
and rules of origins.
All right, let me bring in the others, Kim Beng. Gareth, what do you think China's priorities might be? A counterweight to US influence? Is it more political than economic?
I think it's very much more political than economic. That this trade deal has obviously generated a lot of excitement, coming as it has on the back of the trade war between the US and China, and obviously the global pandemic. But all these countries, or most of these countries, trade quite freely with each other anyway. That tariffs are already very low, so they're basically going to lower tariffs from what are already very low levels to lower them further. So the economic benefit of this is actually going to be quite small. It's not one of these new age trade deals like the TPP, which focused a lot more on non-tariff barriers. So it's very much a political thing for China. It's allowing to kind of cast itself as a champion of globalization. It's also allowing to increase its influence in Asia and kind of take over that role from the US. So it's very much a political thing rather than economic benefits from China's perspective.
Stan, Gareth mentioned there the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the US intended to be a part of, but President Trump quit it. Would you think President-elect Biden want to renegotiate access to the TPP, and how easy would that be should he want to try and do that?
I mean, I would hope so. Obviously, the narrative here in American politics over the past 5 or so years has been that, the vote for soon-to-be former President Trump was in part an expression of discontent about globalization, about international trade, and so I think that's made politicians a little more hesitant to support new free trade agreement. And in fact, President-elect Biden has said that he will not, out of the gate, start negotiating new trade agreements. That said, I think at the same time, we've seen a rise of concern about China's role in the world and behavior at home. And so if CPTPP or TPP can be framed as really an instrument to isolate China, to reduce its power and influence in the region, then I think it's much more politically palatable. I think that's what we should hope for. I think also, of course, just like this agreement, the TPP agreement would have significant economic advantages. So I'd hope that President Biden would push for the U.S. rejoining, regardless of the geopolitical considerations. But I think the geopolitical considerations are important, and in the political context, potentially crucial.
Okay. Kim Beng, Gareth was also saying how already tariffs are very low between these countries on many goods. But how difficult is it to bring such diverse economies and cultures from New Zealand to Laos, for example, together? How do you get an agreement to be any deeper than this one already is? How difficult is it?
That's a very good question. And I agree with my colleague in United Kingdom that the benefits are very low. In fact, a research has been done on what the countries can gain out of RCEP. If and when the whole agreement is ratified, the GDP, the benefits from the GDP will only accrue to little less than 0.2% for each member state. So it's more political rather than economic. Having said so, this is one of the most difficult agreements to come up with. As your commentator mentioned earlier, it took 8 years to reach this stage. In fact, I would go even further back. The member states of Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, began the process of negotiating free trade agreement with China way back in 2002 and only achieving their goal in 2010. So that process also took 8 years. That's 2002 to 2010. And then 2 years later, the countries decided to, especially China, Japan, and Korea, decided to expand the size and the scale of the free trade area, which is what we now refer to as RCEP.
OK, Gareth, one significant aspect of this agreement is on the rules of origin. Just give us very quickly, let people understand what rules of origin means and how that will benefit trade within this new group.
Yeah, I think this is one of pretty much the only kind of non-tariff benefit that you'll see from this. And whereby it means that if a good is imported, a component is imported from one country to another, then sold off to a third, it basically facilitates this trade that otherwise could get caught up in lots of different tariff levels. So it should make it a lot easier to establish the kind of supply chain networks that you see in China across the region. So there should be some benefit there. I think the other point to make out as well is that a lot of these tariff reductions, they're going to take place over a number of years. They're not going to happen straight away. And they're also missing out the agricultural sector pretty much entirely. So, you know, the benefits from this are going to take a long time to come to fruition. It's not going to provide a kind of short-term stimulus or a short-term boost to regional growth in any way whatsoever.
And Gareth, for the US economy, for US exporters, do the rules of origin agreement for this new grouping make it harder for US exporters? Is it something they should be bothered about?
I don't think the US exporters will be bothered about this so much, but I think what it does show is that they're potentially missing out on the fastest growing market in the world. That they spent so much time negotiating the TPP, both as a counterweight to China, but also as a way to boost export markets. And then for Trump to kind of unilaterally withdraw on the first day in office was a real hammer blow to them. So it'll be interesting to see what Biden wants to do regards trying to maybe negotiate or renegotiate the US deal there. I suspect that, given there's no appetite in Congress for further free trade deals, that you probably won't see much progress on that. But it's very much a case of wait and see there.
Stan, do you think US exporters will suffer because of this new agreement?
I mean, I think I agree with Gareth. You have two effects from these kinds of regional groupings. One, it facilitates trade within the grouping, but obviously there's a little bit of divergence of trade that otherwise would have happened with third countries outside of the grouping. But let me go back to something that's come up a couple of times now. I think there's a bit of disappointment on how this trade agreement does not extend beyond sort of your traditional tariff reductions toward things like labor market or environmental regulations. I think it's important to keep in mind that also cuts both ways, right? On the one hand, of course, if you have a deeper agreement that presumably facilitates the more efficient allocation of capital, and there may be equity concerns about the way in which workers are treated in some countries. At the same time, of course, the more different countries are, the greater the potential is for gains from trade, right? And so you do have particularly large benefits from free exchange when countries start from relatively different positions in terms of their regulations, their strengths, their weaknesses. And so I think that's important to keep in mind, because I think there's, and we saw that in the renegotiation of NAFTA here as well, there is a tendency to just try and impose all of your domestic rules on other countries. And that's not always, I think, the way to go from an economic perspective.
OK. And Kim Beng, China and Japan, they don't already have any sort of mutual free trade agreement. Tokyo's wary of Beijing's growing military power. China's economy has overtaken Japan. How is Japan benefiting from this? How might it benefit from this?
Well, Japan is a growing society. The Japanese economy was doing very well prior to the pandemic because it was heading towards the Tokyo 2020 Olympics. But having seen the effects of the pandemic, the impact is actually very galling. Tourism, the statistics on tourism going into Japan has dropped by an earth-shattering 99%. So basically, nothing is really moving. And if the question is on how Japan can handle China's enlarged footprint or role in the region, I think Japan would still cling on to the United States, potentially hoping that the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement would be brought back by President Joe Biden, or President-elect Joe Biden right now, to exceed what RCEP can provide to Japan.
OK. Gareth, about Australia, I wanted to ask you. It's China's top trade partner. Beijing has slapped import restrictions of some sort or other on shellfish, wine, beef and barley after Canberra called for investigations into the origins of the COVID-19 outbreak. Can Australia benefit from this? Is there a way for it to diversify away from China?
Potentially, if they could sell more to other markets in Asia, those goods that China's slapped tariffs on. But ideally, from Australia's point of view, this deal will make it harder for China to impose these retaliatory measures. So I think that's the main way that Australia could presumably benefit from this. I think the key point to bear in mind with this discussion on the Australia-China spat is that the goods that we're talking about at the moment that have been subject to these retaliatory tariffs, they're actually quite a small deal from Australia's perspective. I think there would be quite significant economic ramifications if, for example, China started to impose duties on Australian iron ore, which is the big thing that Australia sells to China. But I think that's very unlikely to happen for the simple reason is that China is very dependent on imports of Australia of iron ore. So it's a very kind of symbiotic relationship in that respect. So I think that's the kind of key point to bear in mind, that these retaliatory measures you've seen so far from China have been quite small, but they should actually be harder to introduce, if this new agreement does have the teeth that it should have.
And Stan, if we can take a look at global trade, I'll tell you what Singapore's Prime Minister remarked when this agreement was signed. He said, multilateralism is losing ground. The RCEP shows support for closer and connected supply chains and closer interdependence. Of course, the Trump administration took the opposite view, as had the UK with Brexit. Who will be on the right side of this argument?
Well, I think the Trump administration's policies, I don't think have accomplished a ton, and in many ways, I think have backfired. Obviously, the Trump administration did not succeed in isolating China, or really even in getting it to make direct bilateral concessions beyond promises of purchases of soybeans, which I don't think is the grand geopolitical interest that the likes of Steve Bannon used to tout. And so I think there we've seen kind of a backlash. If you look at poll numbers in the U.S. now, support for higher levels of immigration has gone up since 2016. Trade has gotten a bit more popular too, though the politics are a bit more regional, and so that's more complicated. But I do think we've seen a bit of a backlash there. I think it's reassuring to see this kind of agreement in the context of the pandemic and the economic downturn. I think the Biden administration, putting China aside for a moment, will surely return to, at least in terms of process, more multilateralism, if not a full embrace of new trade agreements. And so I do think we've seen some pushback. I think it's very difficult to argue that, to go to your question on the UK, it's very difficult to argue that the Brexit process has been a smooth one that has brought the UK tremendous benefit. I think the UK is performing worse macroeconomically than practically any other country in Europe. It's obviously been almost 5 years now. They still haven't been able to sign new trade agreements with their main trading partners. They still haven't figured out how to deal with the situation in Ireland, et cetera. And so, I think that move away from globalization, from multilateralism, from free trade, and at least some room for immigration flows, I think that has really failed and shown to be a bit of a scam, to be honest.
Kim Beng, do you think this is a shot in the arm for multilateralism, given that it could take years for this deal to be fully ratified? It's got to be ratified by at least 6 countries. There's less emphasis on labour rights, on environmental and intellectual property protection. What does it say for multilateralism?
Well, first of all, this is only the beginning of the journey, a very complex and difficult journey. The agreement itself, the RCEP agreement itself, is 510 pages with a lot of annexes. When an agreement has a lot of annexes, it doesn't bode well, to be frank. As a Malaysian, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry was very ebullient that this will open up the regional economy for Malaysia. Personally, I disagree completely. I think he's on the wrong side of understanding the agreement, because first of all, 6 ASEAN countries out of 10 would have to ratify the agreement over the next 2 years, and then another 9 dialogue partners out of 15 from the whole framework would have to ratify them further, and that includes Australia. So there are a lot of hoops to jump through over the next 2 years. Now, there's one little point that I would just like to add with regards to what my UK colleague has mentioned on rules of origin. Maybe people who are very enmeshed and involved in trade will feel very happy, because the rules of origin say that anything that is within the threshold of 40% would qualify for a tariff-free threshold to export or sell their goods into another country, and anything that is sourced from another region that are not part of RCEP, going as far as 60% would still qualify. Maybe that is the reason for what the ebullience and the exuberance and the joy. But personally, I don't think this is a good agreement. And
Gareth, very quickly then from you, is this a good sign that multilateralism is the future, or are we being a bit too optimistic and ideas like Brexit are the way forward?
I think it's certainly a step in the right direction. It does show that outside of the US and the UK, that most countries remain keen on free trade and closer agreements with each other. But I think the benefits of this, despite it being touted as the biggest free trade agreement in the world, are quite small, and they won't come into effect for a number of years. So I wouldn't get too carried away by it.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. We're out of time, unfortunately. Thanks to all our guests, to Kim Beng, to Gareth Leather, and to Stan Voiger. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further debate, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Bernard Smith, and the entire team here, bye for now.